Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name's Melanie, and I'm the Programs Coordinator here at Hornsby Library. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently on the traditional land of the Darug and Gurungai people, and I recognise the continuing connection to land, culture, community and story. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to our online author talk with Dr. Liz Allen. She's here to celebrate her wonderful new book, The Future of Us. Before we begin, I just want to let you all know that we'll have time for questions at the end of the talk. So on your screen, you'll see a Q&A button and you can type any questions you have for Liz in there. Liz is a demographer and academic. In the introduction to The Future of Us, she describes demography as being like a superpower that can change the future. I think that Liz certainly must have some kind of superpower because she has taken a whole lot of data that I would ordinarily have found pretty impenetrable on its own, and she's transformed it into a very human story about Australia that's bursting with ideas and possibilities. I could not be more happy to introduce her to you all. Welcome, Liz.
Hello, what a lovely introduction. I come to you from Canberra, which is the land of Ngunnawal First Nations Australians. The land upon which I come to you has never been ceded, and it's important to recognise that Australia has a Black history, and it's something that we will touch on, I'm sure, during this discussion tonight. I also come to you from a very sparkly background because I'm sitting in my teenage daughter's bedroom as we do, coping through certainty. While my children and dogs are in the front part of the house, I'm sure you'll hear them chiming in throughout the proceedings tonight.
It makes it all real for us, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Now, Liz, in your book, you've described your education as your passport to freedom. You experienced homelessness as a teen and you were a really young mum. You probably aren't the stereotype that most people have in mind when they imagine an academic. One of the things that you talk about is the assumptions that underpin our projections. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what that means in demography.
Yeah, so I come, as you said, from a very, I guess, less traditional background than most people in academia generally. And with that, the experiences that I come with the baggage I come with, I experienced disadvantage and homelessness and a teen motherhood and the whole lot. I was a high school dropout, and my birth was, I guess, this idea of destiny and demography. It was so, my fate was almost written, that my pathway through life, my trajectory would follow a particular way given the circumstances of my disadvantage early in life. And we see, however, that education can be a passport to freedom. It is one way that we can break down the barriers of disadvantage through just simple opportunities. I mean, it sounds simple, it sounds almost utopian, but it is. It's about giving people opportunities to leap out of the circumstances of their destiny, of their birth. Now, it's important when we look at demography, often we consider just the kind of the overall overarching and aggregate figures, and we base our demographic understanding upon statistics and theories that are somewhat outdated and very, very paternalistic in some sense, and definitely problematise women. The issue that we have with projections and demographic statistics that allow us to look into the future is that they're based on assumptions about the now and what might happen between now and so we use the past to give us some indication on where we might be going into the future. And so we're making assumptions about our population that is based on characteristics and relationships in a statistical sense. But those assumptions are somewhat through the lens of so to speak, the white privileged male. And it's something that demography is breaking out of, but it's something to be aware of, that our future is being guided by a very narrow lens of what is known.
There's a certain rhetoric in Australia that if you have a go, you'll get a go. But you say the reality is that our achievements have a lot more to do with the family we were born into than our own personal hard work. Do you think that the class divide in Australia is growing, and are there things that we can do to overcome this kind of inequality?
I think in Australia we've perpetuated a myth through public discourse that it all comes down to hard work. If you work hard enough, then life will grant you opportunities. Hard work does play a role, but the data shows in Australia that there is a class system. Whether we see it or recognise it, it does exist. And more importantly, data shows that the socioeconomic characteristics of your parents, and so the family unit you're born into, do stay with you and have an influencing impact on the life that you possibly can lead. So in other words, there's very little social mobility. That is, if you're born into a poor household, you're likely to live that kind of socioeconomic status for the rest of your life. And as a result of that, say for example, if you are born into a poorer household, excuse me, versus a more wealthy household, the rung upon the ladder of which you stand determines then your access to opportunities with regard to health and education, and they're cumulative across the life course. So the lower upon the foundation of your circumstances that you're born into, the lower the trajectory of your life, and then the gap widens as time goes on. So we are definitely seeing widening and more entrenched social inequality. And what we're now seeing is also an intergenerational transference of inequality, whereby, and we see this particularly in people breaking into the housing market, that it takes the bank of mum and dad, or the death of mum and dad, for people to break into the housing market. That assumes that you're from a wealthy background, so that those that can share the wealth of their family do so and prosper. Meanwhile, those do not. And so we see this quite pernicious kind of rolling ball, if you like, of inequality that just gathers momentum and further entrenches and makes us more unequal over time. And it's something that we don't recognise. And as Australians, we like to think that we think that life is fair and everyone has an equal shot at things. Things like where we live, the socioeconomic status of our birth, do limit and do grant greater or lesser access to opportunities over the life course. And so we are typically stuck in our social circumstances. And I think that then perpetuates a myth about those stuck in as a personal deficit, or something within our DNA that makes us less or different, or we're somehow less of a go-getter. And then those myths then are perpetuated over time, and they're quite harmful because the people that are born into those circumstances start to believe it. I certainly believed it, and demography was my superpower that enabled me to realise that I was not deficient. I am not deficient. It's society's structure that perpetuates these inequalities and lets us see ourselves as somehow different, or others somehow more worthy. And we saw it in the most recent election, when it came to the kind of rhetoric around the death tax and the inheritance tax, and the tax incentives for property investors over renters. We're never going to break free of this, because this idea of kind of a deficiency or a deficit among individuals is what makes us think that we're somehow better or worse than another. It's quite pernicious, as I said, and I don't know how we quite overcome this, because it takes reform, and politically, reform's not something Australians have been quite open to.
There are Australians who aren't comfortable with acknowledging the ongoing impact of the atrocities that have been perpetuated on First Nations people here in this country, you know, ever since white settlement. So much so that I thought during the recent Black Lives Matter protests, they were described by some of our politicians as importing a problem from the United States, like racism and inequality is not a problem that we have in Australia. But what does the data tell us about race in Australia? And how does it impact people that we have so much trouble acknowledging that it is an issue?
So first things, the language of importation. It's something that's used to disempower people and disempower movements. So we hear the word, we're importing a problem, we're importing a virus, we're importing people. People aren't imports, people are people, we're human. And so it's the same kind of language around otherness. It's essentially a creation of otherness and an assertion of dominance as well. This idea that we have a white history in Australia, that white European culture is the dominant culture and has been forever and a day. But the fact is that this land that we reside on has never been ceded, and through the process of colonisation, grave atrocities have occurred, and they're enduring. The harm is enduring. And what happens if we look back to the original establishment of human life on the continent that we now call Australia? It was via sophisticated seafaring. You know, the logistics would have been phenomenal. So this myth that we recreate or retell a history about ourselves, which is based on untruth, and goes against what we know to be the case, you know, that people logistical kind of sophistication across islands and through open water found their way to establish human life in Australia, and did so in such a magnificent way. And we're retelling a story to wipe out and deny an entire Black history of this nation. We are denying, when we're saying that we're importing a crisis or importing an issue from overseas, we're refocusing and denying the history of ourselves. The fact that First Nations babies were stolen from their mothers, women and children and men were killed. There was enslavement of First Nations Australians in our recent history. We overlook that, and we have this a fantastic ability, really, to rewrite history so we find it more comfortable. And we see that still happening today. We're denying the intergenerational trauma that has occurred, and disadvantage among First Nations Australians. We then see this idea of a dominant culture. We see the likes of Pauline Hanson say, well, I was born here, I must be Indigenous. So it's this reclaiming and denying of what's happened. But in doing so, it sets a kind of a normality of the way that we treat others. So anyone who looks other than the dominant white European appearance must be therefore other. They are not Australian until proven Australian. And so we see this, the momentum's quite real, that if you look, sound, or even kind of do something that's un-Australian, you must not be a real Australian. And it's really harmful because we're seeing it at the moment, that with this fear of other comes an uncertainty, but also a fear that we're going to lose our way of life. It's going to be taken from us. And so when people say we're importing a problem, it's it's such a smack in the face of the realities that so many people in Australia experience. First Nations Australians, the much higher imprisonment rate than non-Indigenous Australians. That's not a fault, a personal fault. That is a structural issue. And we keep seeing history repeat itself over and over again. And notice again, I'm saying that there is a structural problem here. And we're not good at addressing those structural problems. Why? Because we have to admit in some form of consensus that the current system isn't working. And the current system is working very well for some people and not for others. And the ones that are wanting to uphold that system are the ones that benefit from that system.
It seems sometimes that it's such an overwhelming problem for us to look at, but I hope that we get better at it. I'd like to talk now a bit about the population debate. So there are certain people who are pretty obsessed with the idea that women should be having more babies and that these should be the right type of babies, because I don't just anybody to be having babies. It's like, is it likely that we could ever have enough children to enough new babies to the point where we can support the ageing population?
Based on what we're seeing at the moment, we are below replacement level birth rates, and we have been for some time. So when we say replacement rates, we're talking about what is required to replace a woman and her partner. Very gender-centric, isn't it? So it kind of puts it blame squarely on women. As I said, we've got an issue in demography. But so we're not replacing ourselves on that via births. We have more births than ever in terms of the numerical sense of births. But when we look at per population and per woman birth rates, that's certainly, it's not enough to replace ourselves. Now, in and of itself, that's not an issue, because that the fact that birth rates have declined over time is a mark of success, in that we are seeing greater gender equality in education and in workforces in terms of representation. And you just think about it, if you have children, it makes it pretty hard to participate in work and in education. So we don't have the systems yet required for women to fully participate, and that comes via childcare. So unless something drastically occurs, I don't think we will get to replacement fertility anytime soon. And in fact, during the current situation, there is such a high level of socioeconomic uncertainty that in similar times, and I'm talking all the way back to the Great Depression, we see birth rates decline. And in the case of the Great Depression, the birth rates declined quite rapidly and stayed low until there was more certainty around the place. And so we are likely to see a bit of a decline in birth rates, I suspect. What most worries me is that the data through social surveys already shows that couples are having fewer children than they would like. Why? Because life gets in the way, right? And that's something that governments need to address. We've not had a baby boom since the kind of real baby boom of decades past. Don't think Peter Costello's mug got everyone getting jiggy with it and having children. That's not the case. We didn't have a baby boom because of the baby bonus. People weren't having babies to get their plasma TVs. It was just a demographic blip. It was going to happen anyway. So unless we see some real reform around the structures like childcare and things like that, we're not going to see a return to replacement level fertility. We might likely see it decline. Or go having children. That is, during this next little while, there will be missing children in our demography. Now, I think that for me that sits quite uncomfortable for me, the idea that And we couple that with the fear around climate change, the real fear around climate change and the uncertainty there, is we have so many factors at the moment that are putting great pressure on young people. Add the addition to that security and employment and housing are problematic. We're going to get to the point where we might see birth rates fall so low, low fertility is what it's referred to, that they don't ever come back. This is what we're seeing in China. This is what we're seeing in Singapore and some European countries. When fertility rates get to about 1.6, 1.5 births per woman, and at the 1.7, then they're unlikely to bounce back. What that means is they're going to be serious demographic pressures on our population as the population becomes structurally older. That is, more people are exiting the workforce, retiring out of the workforce, than entering. That then, and it sounds crude, but them's the breaks and this is the money. How do we fund our well-being that we've become accustomed to? It's through individual income tax payments, right? So if we think about the pool of people in the workforce, we need some kind of pipeline of people to help us support the roads, the schools, the health system, everything that we've become accustomed to in this country. We risk our well-being going backwards, that the Australia that we gift to our children might be less than the Australia that we've experienced. In real terms, that's what we're faced with. Migration is one way that we can help ease the burden on the workforce. There is some question, some people are concerned about immigration intake, the number and the pressure that puts on our cities and our transportation networks. But without immigration, we would be in real trouble. Greater pressure would be put on young people in particular to do work and the like that perhaps they don't choose to do, and then becomes a pressure on that work-life balance. And at the moment, as I said before, we've not got those systems in place that favour a working family and a particular working mother. That there's a lot of reform that's needed. We're not there yet. So immigration is one way to help us while we get our stuff sorted.
Because I wanted to ask you about immigration, because I think certainly in a lot of pockets of the media and, you know, when we listen to politicians as well, there's this suggestion that migrants will come here and they will, you know, steal jobs from our young people and use the welfare system. But I wanted to ask you whether or not the data supports that as being true.
The data does not support migrants as welfare cheats or migrants that come to Australia and take advantage of our welfare system. In fact, the opposite is true. In order to migrate to Australia, you need to prove that you can support yourself. You need to take out health insurance. You can't access welfare. You can't use Medicare. So it's this, again, it's this myth that's been perpetuated that we're somehow giving away our Australian birthright to migrants that are getting a one-up on us. And that's quite troubling because it pits individuals against each other. It pits Australians against Australians. And the other thing too, do migrants steal our jobs? No. Migrants, the data has shown that that on the balance of things, migrants help in the demand side of the economic balance sheet. They also help through different and innovative skill sets that the Australian market doesn't have. So they help teach the local market, young people. So it's about skill sharing. So migrants don't take jobs of the locals. They fill much needed positions in terms of labour that the local population don't want to perform, that don't want to do particular jobs or aren't skilled for. So the data doesn't support this very, very common rhetoric. And what's so interesting is if we look at our white Australia history, this idea that in order for one to come to Australia and be Australian, you must be the European white who can speak English and is a good, proper English person, has kind of perpetuated this idea that if you're not that, then you're not Australian, and if you're somehow other, then you're not quite Australian, you're still another. It also perpetuates this idea that we might be losing our dominance. And this real fear of losing one's dominance is mostly held among older people. This is typical kind of average data. So there's always difference along these lines, but definitely gradient. If we look at the perceptions and attitudes that are held by people across the life course, older people typically hold more concerned views or less tolerant views to migrants. And that, if we look back to the White Australia policy, I wasn't born during the White Australia policy, I was born after, but my parents were born during and were raised in those circumstances. So even my generation and most of the people in politics that are our elected officials were raised in an environment either under the White Australia policy or by people who were raised under the White Australia policy that have this language of otherness and language of concern about loss of dominance. And if we look to the majority sources of it's India and China. And I think that as we're shifting from the old white Australian immigration to a different part of the world, it is causing a lot of fear. But that fear is felt by people, older people, and not so much about younger people. Younger people typically hold a more positive view of the contributions of migrants and the help that migrants offer them at the beginning of their career, which is quite interesting, I think. It means that, again, when we're seeing a lot of pressure on young people.
I thought, like, following on from that, something that we've seen recently is China warning students to reconsider travelling to Australia for study, you know, because there has been a rise in racism post-COVID and things like that. And I wonder, again, when, you know, there's this rhetoric around migrants, but also I often see around international students that they are perhaps taking places of at universities that Australian students could have otherwise, or things like that. But again, is that the case? And what are the potential implications for that? If students are frightened to come here to study, how does it affect our universities?
Oh, look, it's a very topical issue at the moment, and one that will continue to be an issue for the higher education sector. There's no doubt that migrants and students who typically come to Australia as temporary migrants and then leave after they establish their degree, not always, they might then apply to permanently stay. There's a terrible attitude toward this, what is considered one of Australia's top 3 or 4 exports in terms of economic value. As an educator and as someone who has worked in the higher education sector for, you know, a decade, and who has studied alongside people from around the world, provides such a diversity of opinion and experiences on our campuses. Our colleagues, our superiors, our students, the people we learn from. It's deeply concerning for me, because I've seen firsthand what that prejudice and racism can do. I recall one occasion, would have been last year. It was just after the government had announced a cut from 190,000 permanent migrant intake to 160,000. And there was a lot of quite nasty comments in the media about the value that migrants were making to the nation, and this idea that they were stealing from the locals. Again, there's no data to support that that's what's occurring, by the way. But this one student was sitting in a class, and I got to know her. She was quite a quiet student, but she was there. She was a constant, and she was always quite animated and happy to be there. This day she looked quite off, and I could sense that there was something wrong. And I approached her in the break and I said, "Are you okay?" And she just broke down in quite, sobbing tears. And I thought, this is in the hallway in between the class breaks. And I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "It's okay, Liz. I just have to get used to it." I said, What do you mean? What do you have to get used to?" And she experienced a quite nasty race-based attack on the public transport system here in Canberra. And she said, "It's okay, Liz, though. I've just got to get used to it. That's just the way of life." And I think it's not just a way of life. And, we like to think that Canberra is somehow enlightened, and as the capital city of the capital of the nation is somehow more refined, but it's not. We're in a place like Canberra. We have abuse occurring on the transport system towards people that not necessarily are migrants, but look different. And it was so troubling to me and we see this, and I see this every time we see something major happen in the media or a response around a particular event. It seems to be Asian students or students every time. So race-based attacks occur. I see them occurring, and I know about them more so after these kind of major events. What we're seeing at the moment, and we know from the reporting of race-based attacks that they are increasing, and they're not just increasing in number, they're increasing in terms of their ferocity. What that means is that we are then become an unwelcoming place. Not only are we unwelcoming to people who take a risk and help the nation, we then turn on ourselves. Australians against Australians fighting for something that we're not fighting for anything real. There's no win or lose in this game. Has done is quite fascinating, because definitely there are political motivations to that, but at the same time, as someone who I see these things increasing, and I'm not the victim or the survivor of these attacks, but I see them occurring through what students tell me, and it's a worrying trend. A lot of people say to me, "Well, Australia's doing really well in this COVID crisis at the moment. Maybe more people will come to Australia because we've, health tourism. People will want to be in Australia because we've done so well with COVID." I don't know. If you look at the way that a family outbreak of COVID in Victoria has been reported, it's been blamed on their faith. It's been blamed on the type of social mixing one does. It's again where we're pointing the finger and looking to issues that aren't us and blaming something that's not us. But in doing something like that, we're hurting all of us. And it's a real issue. We risk going backwards. We risk at a time when we need to be seen as welcoming, because of our socio-demographic factors. We need migrants. We're competing with the likes of the UK, Canada, the US. They're just going to go there over coming here. And that's the reality of it. If we are not seen as a safe and welcoming place, it's, cutting off the nose to spite the face, so to speak.
I saw the New Zealand director and actor Taika Waititi sort of make a joke that in Australia we often talk about New Zealand as being sort of like, you know, like our cute younger brother or cousin, you know, in relation to countries, and that they actually think of us as being their weird racist uncle. And you know, I don't know that that's the image that I like to think that we're projecting out into the world, although it's hard to deny that that's probably true.
Oh, look, the evidence is certainly there. We are that kind of weird uncle that at a Christmas event you kind of go, you know, stay clear of that one. You know, that's the reputation that we have,
Yeah.
and we have to realise that and we're to blame for that. We're the ones to blame for that weird uncle, avoid that one at the party kind of guy or gal.
Please, everybody, stop being the weird uncle.
You're ruining it for the rest of us.
So we know that women and young people have been disproportionately disadvantaged by the economic impacts of COVID-19. So it was interesting to me to see that the federal government stimulus packages that they've been talking about have been geared towards the building industry at the same time that they've discontinued free childcare. So, you know, to my eye, that seems that they're trying to prop up industries that are male dominated at the same time that they're taking away things that women need to be able to be active in the workplace. What kinds of, like, as a demographer, if you're making suggestions about what we could do to stimulate the economy, or I guess to put things in place that will make it easier for women to work and to recover from this, what would you think we should be doing?
Oh my goodness. Do you know what? We are in a period of nation building, and we have to face the facts there that we need to make major funding and infrastructure investments in, much like we saw post-World War II, to get the economy back on track. We need to be building roads. We need to be making large investments. We need to invest in sectors like the construction industry. However, when we're signalling on one side that that's an important sector, we're at the same time taking away rights and access to something as valuable as childcare for people while they're still working reduced hours, they're still working from home. And who are bearing the brunt of these things? It's women. Women, we see this in the survey data all the time, that despite, even if women are working full-time with a full-time partner, a male partner, women still do the largest share of caring and housework. We have these firmly entrenched around what a woman and a man should do in a relationship. Now, and one way, how do we change a social norm like that? Well, we've got to look at the signalling that we're doing, where we're saying construction, yes, tick, childcare, bow, bow, no. And in doing so, we're setting ourselves back. We're going backwards, right? In my mind, if we're talking about nation building and women are seen as this kind of, we're either we're saviours or problems, women, for the economy. Women are seen as one way to boost the labour force participation rate, and so up the income tax that people pay as individuals. But we've not got the support mechanisms there ready. If we're talking about nation building, we need to make childcare more accessible. The people who have jobs would not actually be eligible for childcare because under the tests, they wouldn't meet the requirements. So these things need to be invested in, and it needs to be a reconsideration of these signals that are being sent that places value on some types of people over others. It comes back to this thing at the beginning of our discussion, about this idea that some people are the preferred people to be having children and others not. It's this same sort of things, and we still see this built into family tax benefit and things like that. Who are eligible, who's not. These sorts of things trap into our system a structural signal that says you're the person to be having children, you not so much. We're going to support you, you not so much. That needs to change. We need to consider as a nation where we want to be, how we're going to get there. It requires all of us on board. If that's the case, then women and young people need to be in this conversation. We need a seat at the table. No longer should we be forcibly, leaning in or leading out. We've just got to be there. And at the moment, we're not.
I thought something that was interesting reading the book that I guess we know about anyway is troubling is that, it seems that we live in a time where people have a different relationship to the truth and to facts. And you use the example of anti-vaxxers or climate change deniers. And it would seem to me that we're also denying the data that we see in demography. And I certainly don't expect that you have any answers to that, but I wonder how that feels for you in your industry when you can see, clear data and trends and, evidence is there to suggest what we should be doing, and yet that doesn't seem to be what people are making their decisions on. How is that for you when you experience those challenges and see those things happening?
It's fascinating. People can argue with evidence and say, well, there's a problem with that, whatever. But when you see kind of facts and they're clear-cut facts and people are still arguing about, mind you, with the lack of expertise, they're arguing about the validity of these facts, I find that really troubling. But if we think about it, one's perspective on life is determined by our experiences. The things that we experience influence our perspective, and then that influences our behaviour. So if we've experienced something, that helps us understand those differences. I think when I write in the book about this idea that anti-vaxxers and pro-vaxxers, climate deniers and climate science believers, there's a commonality there, and there's a commonality with people that are concerned about and say no immigration versus immigration is good for Australia. We all are concerned about a similar common thing, and that is the well-being. In the case of the vaxxers, no-vax, it's concern about the well-being of a child. In the case of the population debate, the common theme is we're concerned about the well-being of the nation. We can harness that commonality in a way where there's never going to be consensus, and we should never ever strive for everybody to agree on something, because that's not ever going to happen. But we can leverage those commonalities to get us to where we need to be. And that, in my mind, it's a strategy, a blueprint for the future, where we just lay out a mission statement that, if we want to be this nation in the future, what are the steps to achieving that? Now, ideology in terms of politics will differ, and the lens that's applied to that will differ. I'm not naive in thinking it's going to be a hard task. It will be a hard task. But we can draw on those common held beliefs to get people to have a better buy-in, I guess, and ease the tensions and lessen the nastiness of the debate. The debate's nasty. I get death threats sometimes. I appear in news reports or something like that. They're troubling. People hold some very, very strong views on this matter. And the one way we can appease all aspects of the debate is by drawing on those common beliefs.
That's horrific, and I'm sorry that the experience that you have. Now, I think that it's pretty well time to go over to audience questions. But before we do, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that if you buy a copy of Liz's book from Berkelo at Hornsby, we've set something up where Liz has signed some really cute little book plates for us, and she did them all by hand. They're so lovely. So if you get your book from Berkelo, they'll be able to send that to you along with your copy of the book. So I hope you take advantage of it. If you already have a copy of your book and you want a book plate, just send me an email, because I held on to a few of them, so I'll be able to send one out to you. I'm just going to open up the questions now, so bear with me. Beg your pardon, I won't be a second. I took off my glasses so I didn't have reflection, and now I can't actually read anything. Okay, so the first question that I've got is about immigration. So it's a topic that's addressed throughout the book quite frequently. Liz, you mentioned that migrants have been or are the backbone of Australia's economic prosperity, which this person agrees with, but they're a recent migrant from Australia to Australia from Asia, so they're concerned about the rhetoric against locals. So many immigrants think locals are lazy and that it's only the migrants that work hard. Also, what about the interaction between different migrant groups? So when searching for a job in Sydney, there's many places that they feel that they can't hand in their resume because they're not the same ethnic background as the predominant culture, or that they can't speak the language. So their question in the end is, do you actually think we can ever have a truly multicultural Australia?
This is a major philosophical question that and this person has raised some real issues that we're faced with. We like to call ourselves a multicultural country, but we still have the language that suggests that assimilation is preferred, and that one loses and leaves their cultural backgrounds at the boarding and departure gate at the airport, so to speak, as they come to the country. The reality is that when approaching the labour market, if you have a name that looks different, it's spelt different, it's hard to say, it looks, so to speak, ethnic, then definitely there are entrenched prejudices that could work either for or against one's application. There is clear research that altering the name of the person on a resume can actually change that, and so it shows that there is prejudice there. It occurs to it happens for people with Asian sounding or appearing names. First Nations people also experience it, and it's not just about jobs, it's also about applying for a rental and things like that, but also women experience it to a certain extent as well. So there is prejudice that's built into our system, and I think that what Australia does need is a bit of an anti-racism campaign, not just a bit of one, a serious one, and we need to look at the language that we use and those kind of stereotypical assumptions that we're making that someone might be good or bad at a particular job. And that benefits not just this kind of sphere of racism, but it benefits all other realms of difference or minority group. The other thing too is that will we ever truly be able to be a multicultural country? We need to invest in ourselves, and we need to do better than what we're doing. And I'm not sure how we can truly ever be a kind of what I would consider a utopian idea of a multicultural nation. But if we want to call ourselves a multicultural nation, like the politicians do, they can't then turn around and say something that undermines that. Their language and their words need to be held to account. It needs to be stated back to them so that they are not fueling these stereotypical problems that then cause real world issues for individuals and communities.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, it's a troubling thing to think about, really. Now, when I was reading your book, I think, you really showed overall a sense of optimism and hope for the future. Is that how you feel now? Has the way I guess like the COVID crisis, I think has brought out some of the less positive traits in Australia. Are you still feeling positive about our future?
I am still feeling positive about our future. I think that what we've proven during this current crisis is that we are incredibly good at innovating, and that we've proven how we can work from home. We can, with a telecommunication network that works, we can do these things, and we can reimagine the way that the world operates, and the way that we operate within the community in Australia. So in my mind, I think we have so much to look forward to. During this nation building process, there will be a feeling like, I suspect, like the post-World War II era, of this kind of period of golden years. But it requires effort, and we've got to stop relying on our luck in this country that she'll be right, it'll all be good at the end. We do need to work hard, we need to invest in ourselves. But at the end of the day, I guess what drives me is that I want to ensure that the country I leave this world with is the same, if not better, than I've experienced. I want to ensure that we leave a good mark, and we leave behind a good mark, and leave this place in a good position. And I think that we have an opportunity now to make opportunities of our challenges in probably a better way than we did leading into this crisis. There are still demographic challenges, but we now come to these things, I guess, with a new kind of vision of what the potential possibilities could be. And I think that through that, we've proven great strength, and we can come out of this. We've proven we can come out of this. We just have to work together and reform, get that word back into our vocabulary at a political level. We need to be able to make real change, substantive change, in our policy and in our social structures to be the best we can be.
Thank you, Liz. I think that that's probably a wonderful place to leave it. I just want to say thank you so much for your time. The people at home won't really know, but we had Liz booked to come here in real life before everything happened, and we were all just devastated that this was something that we thought we would miss out on. So I'm so happy that Liz was able to find the time to come and speak with us online. Thank you so much to everybody at home for joining us. I know that it can be really easy to, find something else to do when you get home after a long day at work. So thank you so much for being here and for giving us your time and attention. Once again, don't forget that you can get a copy of the book if you would like to. I really recommend it. It's a wonderful and thought-provoking book that I enjoyed very, very much. So good night to everybody. I hope we see you all at another event very soon. And thank you again, Liz.
Thank you.
Okay, good night, everyone.